All right, this is Tom Barry here with a friend, colleague, and admirer of mine, Nathan Hovekamp. And Nathan got a background in biology. He's taught animal behavior for the psychology discipline here at the college. Well versed in understanding animal behavior. Your interest was in birds, ornithology. Is that correct? Would that be the correct terminology? So I want to call upon you as sort of provide some perspective. You have a deeper knowledge base than I do in this area. But one thing that kind of fascinates me a little bit is that oftentimes I've heard before, things like, this is just who we are. And we're like, like animals. And usually when that comes up, it's usually this darker component, this idea of humans as being self-interest, competition, survival of the fittest, like all the social Darwinistic stuff that comes up. Even ideas like the alpha male, like is very, it's like we have this idea about the alpha male, and there's, an article I was reading by Franz de Waal, who kind of works in this area. He gives talks at corporations, and he kind of has to kind of work with that because in the corporate culture, that language is fairly common, but doesn't fit the reality in terms of how that alpha male may work and operate within certain animal groups and populations. It's sort of this mythology that gets developed within particular cultures. And so I think it's very selective sometimes when people take ideas from nature and apply them to human to give justification for why humans are the way that they are. This happens in sexuality and gender. People don't understand the complexity of sexuality and gender in the animal world. So they'll take a few examples, apply them, and say, well, that's just how humans are. And the reality is the animal world is incredibly complex. So I'd like if you could share for us examples, illustrations of how in the animal world of altruism, self-sacrifice, cooperation, other things that are about social bonding and connectivity. Yeah, sound good?
Sounds good, man.
Awesome, thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me here, Tom, for this conversation. And that there was previously a traditional context for thinking about evolution in terms of the persistence of behaviors through generation in terms of the selfish gene, which I think was a phrase that is most closely associated with Richard Dawkins and some of the British evolutionary biologists and naturalists of the 20th century. And essentially the idea is that animals, including humans, behave in ways that pass on, that end up passing on the majority of their genes to subsequent generations. So the greater proportion of your genes in the gene pool, the better off you were from an evolutionary perspective. So it was just sort of this notion of the selfish gene. And the problem with that, or the issue with that, is you've put your finger on it exactly, Tom, is how do you account for instances of altruism where in natural animal populations, they appear to behave altruistically or in a self-sacrificing manner, sacrificing ultimately their contribution, genetic contribution to the gene pool in subsequent generations if animals supposedly behave according to those kind of rules. Well, just as a couple of examples, in a colony of prairie dogs, a typical behavior might be in predator surveillance. One prairie dog might stand upright on the colony and give the alarm call, a loud, shrill alarm call when they see a hawk flying over. Well, and then all the other prairie dogs will dodge into their holes and so forth to avoid being taken. And that appears to be counter to what would be adaptive evolutionarily for the alarm giver anyway, because they make themselves a lot more conspicuous to being lunch by that hawk, and yet they're imparting all kinds of advantages to the other prairie dogs in the colony. The explanation for that has come to be kin selection, an area called kin selection, where they've done genetic analyses on social animals like prairie dogs and found that because of the relatedness amongst individuals in the colony, particularly amongst the females, turns out with most mammals, females stay on the natal territory and males are the dispersal sex. At any rate, that you can demonstrate, even still from the selfish gene standpoint, that by giving the alarm call and more of your sisters, your mother, your aunts, your female cousins and so forth survive because of that adaptive behavior, you're actually contributing more genetically because of the degree of relatedness. So this was an idea referred to as kin selection. Another quick example, this reaches an even more extreme in social insects. The order of insects called Hymenoptera, the bees, termites, and ants that live in these massive colonies. And just as a more specific example, in honeybees, the majority of the individuals in the collective, in the hive, are non-reproductive individuals, right? They're workers in social insects. So they're sacrificing their reproductive rights, their direct genetic contribution to subsequent generations. And, you know, it's kind of a head scratcher. What's the evolutionary adaptation? How would this be selected for? How would it persist through generations? And again, the explanation here is very strongly kin selection. It turns out that because of a quirk of genetics in social insects, where the males are haploid or have half the number of chromosomes as the females, which are diploid, the females are actually, it might sound strange, but more closely related to their sisters than they would be to hypothetical offspring of their own. They have a coefficient of relatedness of 0.75 amongst their sisters, and it would only be 0.5, or they would only be half genetically related to the offspring of their own. So by sacrificing, the workers sacrificing their right to reproduce and support the colony, support their sisters, they're actually contributing more genetically to the next generation. And then finally, Tom, just a couple of other phrases, or one other phrase. So in addition to kin selection, now biologists talk in terms of inclusive fitness, that it's not just individual survival and survival of the fittest, but rather an inclusive fitness that looks at how many genes through your relatives, through your kin and so forth, are you ensuring will be contributed to the gene pool and into subsequent generations. This leads directly to your question, really, and in an area that's become quite popular now in biology, of sociobiology, that's most closely associated with like E.O. Wilson, who's now very, very popular in science, sort of one of the senior wise men in evolutionary biology, Harvard entomologist, who looked at social insects again, in his case, leafcutter ants. But and in an emerging thought, and I'll shut up here, I'm going on too long, but an emerging thought that even beyond kin selection and relatedness, that the unit of selection in some ways might be a more collective unit, a group selection almost, that behaviors that impart advantages, evolutionarily adaptive behaviors and so forth, for a population may impart, increased survival collectively. And then other biologists that question that and say, no, it's individual survival and reproductive success that still is the driver of natural selection. And this is a really dynamic area right now.
Yeah, these interesting, for me at least, one point of interest is how the cultural and historical context around which knowledge is being generated shapes which of those viewpoints, which of those bodies of research, that communities of researchers or individuals come to select, right? Because there's it's complicated. And I appreciate your examples and illustrations to kind of identify, add another layer to sort of this complexity and say, there is this a lot going on in the natural world and the animal world that's where the individual is sacrificing, or whether that's sacrificing for potential, basically their life may end as we know it, or they may not be able to reproduce, or their reproductive capabilities are not put back into into for the greater good. But it's cooperative. It's sacrifice for the group. And so appreciate your expertise. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, Nathan. You have yourself a good day.
Thanks, Tom. Good talking with you.
Yeah, you too.